Now, at one point, you asked a lady named Myra Jones Weeks,
Well, she
who was the
one.
granddaughter of Stuart and Elizabeth Perkinson, to write about Cherry Grove before and after the hurricane in 1938. I'd like to read a little of this because it gives the history back, Cherry Grove, way back to the late 1800s.
She was the mother of the two girls that owned the house that we came over first to stay in. That was Aunt. We called her Aunt Myra and Uncle Harry because my mom and dad did not have brothers and sisters, so we didn't have aunts and uncles. So we used to just call them Aunt Myra and Uncle Harry.
She wrote, "I have been asked to write a history of Cherry Grove, and in going back over my memories of my early childhood, I was surprised how clearly I was able to recall the following details, which I am now setting down for you. In 1868, my grandparents, Archer and Elizabeth Perkinson, bought a piece of land on the Great South Beach, extending from Lone Hill, now Fire Island Pines, west to just beyond the present hotel, and from bay to ocean. They paid 25 cents a front foot for it and named it Cherry Grove, because there was a regular forest of black cherry trees just north of a small house which was on the property where the present hotel now stands. Since my grandmother was a wonderful cook, they decided to enlarge the little house and serve shore dinners. In no time at all, the place became well known and popular with sailing parties on the Great South Bay. When my sister, Mrs. Henry Eman, and I were quite small, we visited Cherry Grove each summer, and I remember that host Perkinson used to entertain his guests by playing a big music box which he wound by hand. It looked like the old-fashioned street pianos. In 1895, grandfather had his son Stuart help him run the hotel. And since Stuart and his wife enjoyed the life on the beach, his father sold the place to him. Each year after that, early in the spring, Mr. and Mrs. Stuart Perkinson would leave Patchogue with a scow fastened to their boat. On it would be a horse, a cow, several pigs, many chickens, and a dog. A garden would be planted down by the bay, having been fertilized the previous fall with seaweed, with horseshoe crabs, and fine corn, tomatoes, potatoes, beans, etc. were raised for use with the dinners. The dog would run down to the dock, which in those days was put down each spring and taken up in the fall, to bark a welcome to all visitors. The horse was used to plow the garden and to bring driftwood from the beach to the stoves. The cow gave milk, the chickens supplied fresh eggs and were also eaten fried for dinner. The pigs disposed of the garbage and furnished food for the winter months later on. Blueberries, which could be picked nearby, were made into pies and fritters for dessert. In addition, my cousins and my uncle caught fish, clams, and crabs, so the delicious shore dinners, which began with steamed clams and progressed to fish, chicken, and vegetables, salad, and dessert, came directly from Cherry Grove. In 1921, the Perkinses had sold all the land east of Duryea to Lone Hill, and then divided what was left into 109 building lots. A lot was 50 by 80 feet and could be bought for $250 or less, and oceanfront lots cost no more than $1 a front foot. A few were sold, mostly to relatives, and buildings which were bought from Camp Upton were put up. A commuter's ferry run by a son, Marion Perkinson, left each morning to take the men to Patchogue and returned each evening. Later, after other people from more distant places bought lots and built cottages, another ferry ran from Sayville and train connections were made for New York. In 1922, a post office was established and Mrs. Perkinson was the first postmaster. It was in a combination cottage and store which was located on Ocean Walk, just about where the Monster and Too Much are now. I don't know what year this was written, but...
One time my mother decided to run the store that year, and we got all kinds of. I can't even remember the name of the canned stuff, but she got some. It was a small store, just with canned goods most.
That's what it says here. The store carried only a few canned goods, but a bumboat with ice and vegetables and meat on order used to leave Patchogue about 8 a.m. Its first stop was Cherry Grove, where it stayed about an hour. And
That's
then
where you went down to get your ice. You had an ice box that you had to put ice in, and you had either a 25-cent piece or a 50-cent piece, depending on the size of your ice box. And they had 300 pounds. I think they used to chop them up and get them off the boat. Yeah.
After Cherry Grove, it then went on to Point of Woods, Ocean Beach, Saltaire, and the Fire Island State Park. It arrived at the state park shortly before lunchtime. Our summer was incomplete without at least one trip on the Edward with Captain Dick Nelson Warner, who later operated our general store for years.
We had every summer we had to go at least once down to the Fire Island, and when you went swimming down there, you just swam, but you didn't make any headway because the tide was right by the inlet and was going so fast that you couldn't make any time swimming against it.
In 1929, the first boardwalks were built. A couple of cottages had to be moved because they had been put in the right-of-ways. It was also in 1929 that we had our first flight on July 4th from Patchogue to Cherry Grove. It is the only one ever. Mail amounting to $81 came from all over the world to receive the first flight cachet from Cherry Grove and to be sent out from here. When Captain Warner later built the store on the corner of Bayview and Cherry Grove Walks, the post office was moved to the store, and he became the second postmaster of Cherry Grove. The bumboat was discontinued, but the Edward long remained a familiar sight on the Great South Bay. In the 1938 hurricane, with Captain and Mrs. Warner, Mr. and Mrs. John Thurber, old Stuart Perkinson, and Mr. Ronald Gerardette aboard, it started to make the trip to Patchogue, but ended up at Long Cove High and Dry, where they were forced to stay all night. Your maiden name is Gerardette?
Yes.
Correct. House movers were needed to get it afloat again. About half the cottages were washed away at Cherry Grove during that storm, and ours was one of them. The only one left on the ocean front was the Lewis Cottage, which had just been purchased 2 weeks previously by the Gerardettes. Poor Mr. Lewis. It was on the lot where the present beach home is and was called Hurricane House.
Right.
It was sold to Mr. and Mrs. Wilkie Rustin and moved west to Seawalk on the ocean front. It was later purchased by Mrs. Charles Harrison Goddard and has had several extensive additions made, but the original house is still there.
And turned this way, not all of them were this way. When my mom had it, it was front and back, but now it's this way down on the beach.
We were among the first to come back and rebuild our house, but sold it a few years ago to the Gerardettes. It is next door to the one they live in and is called Best Bet. Their daughter is your Cherry Grove reporter. Signed, Myra Jones Weeks, granddaughter of Stuart and Elizabeth Perkinson.
We used to call her, like I said, Aunt Myra and Uncle Harry, because we didn't have any aunts and uncles.
Now, when the war came, World War II, your husband enlisted, correct, in the Navy?
He had signed up in Sayville, of course, and at that time we were living in Arlington. And George Hubbard was head of the whatever group it was that called people. And he was friends with George, and he got a hold of George, and he said, if you don't want to be just pulled into the Army, you better enlist. So he did enlist in the Navy. At that time, we had 3 kids. And so he wasn't in very long, because right after that, in fact, his ship left. I think they were told to go out of Norfolk and get out to sea. And so they did, but they were only, they got to England, but they didn't get off. They just had to come around. And George said he thought it was so funny because they had cooked spaghetti and they had it in big pots. And he said the ship was going like this, and the spaghetti was over, and they would just jump up and grab the pipes and get up out of the where the spaghetti going around the floor.
He was in the Navy less than a year. They were honorably discharging married men.
Right after,
at that time with children. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then he went back to butchering.
Right.
Yeah, until Captain Hawkins, who owned a gas business here, offered your husband a job over here in the Grove, working for him, correct?
Right.
Okay. Now, after the hurricane, people rented their houses to pay for the repairs. What they did was take out mortgages, and if they could not afford those payments, what they started doing over here was renting out a few weeks at a time to help to pay for the repairs. And that's when single men started coming over here, gay men.
I think so. They started coming from Ocean Beach.
Yeah.
Ocean Beach didn't want her anymore.
Your mother, you told me, was among the first to rent to a group of men.
Right. I don't know if she was first, but she did have a group of men in the one house that we called Sunny. She had asked my brother and me, we had apparently a little money in the bank, probably given to us by some of them. So she said, would you like to buy this cottage? Use your money? And we said yes. So that was one that was called Sunny Jean. Mm-hmm. And that's where we always called my brother Sunny.
At first, you said they got a big kick out of watching the gay men.
Oh, well, we said the people in this house, they seemed to have one man who was older and
house mother
or something. And he would go down, we could watch him, he would go down and feel the ocean. And then he would come back and tell them, well, they could go in. We thought that was funny.
Now, interestingly enough, most of the gay men were going to Ocean Beach, as you said.
Right.
I understand, not from you, so someone else told me that there had been an incident where someone tried to seduce the teenage boy of someone who was very important there in Ocean Beach. And there was a big stink about it, and Ocean Beach announced that gay people were persona non grata there. And that was just coincidental that people over here were starting to rent their cottages. And so all the gays moved into Cherry Grove. Interesting. And
Erwin Shednovsky, do any of you remember Erwin Shednovsky? He had one house, he used to have the house where Michael is with the flowers now. They had a house there. And Myron, what was his name? Look. He had one too. And he used to take a part in the shows at the beginning where he put on makeup and like he was sitting in front of a mirror, only you could see him. He was putting on the makeup. That was good.